Namaste. Today I am going to talk about lobes and sulci of cerebrum. Hope you're going to like it and subscribe my channel. Cerebrum. Cerebrum is considered as the largest part of the brain that fills the most of the cranial cavity. In this picture you can see this structure. This is known as a cerebrum. This cerebrum extends anteriorly to the posterior part of the cranial cavity. Whereas in the posterior part of the cranial cavity, what will happen is that this cerebrum is located just above this tent-like structure which is formed by the folds of the dura mater. It is known as a tentorium cerebelli. It is located just above the tentorium cerebelli. The cerebrum consists of the two hemispheres, the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. This one is the right cerebral hemisphere and this one is the left cerebral hemisphere. The right and the left cerebral hemisphere is separated by each other by a fissures that extend anteriorly to the posteriorly. This fissure is known as the median longitudinal fissures. Within this fissures, there is the presence of the structure that is present within this fissures. That is the flux cerebri and the anterior cerebral arteries. This flux cerebri is also the fold of the dura mater. This is the cerebral hemisphere and this is a superior view of the cerebral hemisphere. Within this cerebral hemisphere, there is the presence of this fissure which I have already discussed. This is known as the median longitudinal fissures. When you go deep to the median longitudinal fissures, there is the presence of the convulsive fibers which is known as the corpus callosum. Now, what are the features of the cerebrum? Within this cerebrum, there is the presence of the folds, and this fold is known as a gyri. Between each gyri, there is the presence of the deep cleft. This portion is known as a sulci. Now, what is the importance of the gyri and the sulci is that it helps to increase the surface area of the cerebral cortex. Now, within this cerebral hemisphere, it consists of the pole. The anterior part, this portion is known as a frontal pole, and this portion is known as a occipital pole. Now, this frontal pole is present in the anterior ends of the hemisphere, and it is more rounded compared to the occipital pole. When you come to the occipital pole, this portion is located in the posterior end of the cerebral hemisphere and it is more pointed compared to the frontal pole. Now, one more pole that is present, this pole is known as a parietal pole. This parietal pole is located behind this sulci, which is the main sulcus. This is known as a central sulcus. And inferiorly, there is the presence of the one more sulcus, that is the posterior rami of the lateral sulcus. And this portion is known as a parietal lobe, parietal poles. Now, the temporal poles. This area is known as the temporal pole. It is located just below this sulcus, which is known as a lateral fissures. This temporal pole is directed forwards and downwards. Now, the surfaces that is present. Superior lateral surface. This whole portion is known as a superior lateral surface. It is more convex and is more extensive. It faces upwards and laterally. This portion is known as the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It is flat. Within this, there is the presence of the sheath-shaped, that is thick, commissive fibers that is present. This portion is known as the corpus callosum. Now the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This whole portion is known as the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It is irregular in shape because it has to adapt the floor of the anterior and the medial cranial fossa. This inferior surface is divided into the two parts. The anterior part is smaller. This is the orbital surface. The posterior part is larger. This is known as the temporal surface. This orbital surface and the temporal surface is separated by a groove. This groove, which is the starting point of the lateral sulcus, and this is known as the stem of the lateral sulcus. Now one more border that is present is the superior medial borders. Now this portions which is present superiorly, this border is known as the superior medial border. This superior medial border separates the surfaces that is present, superior lateral surface, from this surface which is known as the medial surface. Now another border that is present is the superciliary borders. This border is known as the superciliary borders. It is present at the junction of the superior lateral and the orbital surface. This portion is known as the orbital surface. Lateral, superior lateral, there is the presence of the superior lateral surfaces, and it is separated by this border which is known as the superciliary border. Now one more border that is present inferiorly, this border is known as the inferior lateral border. This inferior lateral border separates this surface, this is known as the superior lateral surface, from the inferior part of the surface which is known as the temporal surface. Now one more border that is present which is known as the medial orbital borders. This border is known as a medial orbital border. It separates this area which is known as the orbital surface from this area which is known as the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now one more another borders that is present which is known as the inferior medial border or the hippocampal border. This border is known as the hippocampal border, or it is also known as the inferior medial border. It surrounds the structure that is present here which is known as the cerebral peduncles. Now when you extend this hippocampal border posteriorly, there is continuous and forming one more border which is known as the medial occipital border. This medial occipital border separates this area which is known as the temporal surface from the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now the sulci and the gyra of the lobes of the cerebrum. The main cerebral sulci that is present in the cerebrum are the first one, which is the most important sulci. This sulci is known as a central sulcus. One more sulcus that is present, this sulcus is known as a lateral sulcus. And one more sulcus that is present, calcaneal sulcus and paretaloccipital sulcus. Now the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is also known as a sylvan fissures. This lateral sulcus is a deep cleft. It mainly starts from the inferior surface of the brain. This is the inferior surface of the brain, and this is the orbital surface, and this is the temporal surface. In between that, there is a present deep groove. This is the starting point of the lateral sulcus. And then after that, this lateral sulcus will continue to the superior lateral surface. That's why the lateral surface is present in the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere and the superior lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. The parts of the lateral sulcus is the starting point is known as the stem of the lateral sulcus. Then after that, when this sulcus moves to the superior lateral surface, it will divide into the rami, that is the 3 rami. Now the course of the lateral sulcus. As I have told you, the lateral sulcus begins from the base of the brain, and it extends laterally to cut the inferior lateral borders. Then after that, this lateral sulcus will be present towards the superior lateral surface, and it consists of the 3 rami. Now, as I have already told you, reaching on the superior lateral surface, it consists of the 3 rami. The first one, this rami, is known as the anterior horizontal rami. Then after that, one more rami that is present, this is known as the anterior ascending rami. Then when you go posteriorly, this limb is known as the posterior rami. Now, in between that, there is a presence of the gyri. This is known as the pars orbitalis. And one more gyri that is present here, this is known as the pars triangularis. And within this portion, the number 3, which consists of the gyri, this is known as a pars orbicularis. Now, this gyri is this rami will be divided into the 3 parts. This is the anterior rami, this is the ascending rami, and this is the posterior rami. Now this dividing point, the certain point, this point is known as a sylvan point. That is why this lateral fissure is also known as a sylvan fissures. Now, within this floor of the lateral sulcus, this is the lateral sulcus. Within this floor of the lateral sulcus, there is a presence of the one hemisphere, one lobe, not hemisphere, sorry, it's a lobe. One lobe gets hidden, and this portion is known as the insula. This portion is also known as the islands of rails. It can be located when this lip of the lateral sulcus is retracted. Now the content of the lateral sulcus. It consists of the free margin of the lesser wing of the splenic bone. Along with that, there is the presence of the sinus. This sinus is known as a sphenoparietal sinus. The artery that is present in the superior lateral surface, that is the medial cerebral artery. Deep and the superficial medial cerebral veins. These are the contents of the lateral sulcus. Now this portion is known as a medial cerebral artery, which runs along with the lateral sulcus. Now the one more sulcus that is present in the cerebral hemisphere, that is the central sulcus. This sulcus is known as a central sulcus. It is also known as a sulcus of Rolando. This sulcus begins from the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Then after that, it will cut this border. This border is known as a superior medial border. It is located 1 centimeter behind from the midpoint. Now the course of the central circus. After cutting this border, that is a superior medial border, this central circus will run downwards and forwards. It runs forwards and laterally, making an angle that is the 70° to the median plane. In the lower ends of this, there is located this part which is known as the posterior rami of the lateral sulcus. Now one more sulcus that is present which is known as a calcarine sulcus. This calcarine sulcus, this is the calcarine sulcus which is present in the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It begins as the deep fissures which is present on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It is located exactly the posterior end of the corpus callosum. This is known as the corpus callosum, and this is the posterior end of the corpus callosum. Then after that, this calcarine sulcus will extend towards the superior lateral surface. Now one more sulcus that is present in the medial surface, this portion is known as a parietaloccipital sulcus. This parietaloccipital sulcus is present on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It also cuts the superior medial borders, and it's about 4 cm in front of the occipital pole. Now the sulca and the gyrus that is present in the superior lateral surface. In the frontal lobe, there is the presence of the sulcus, which is known as the precentral sulcus. Now this sulcus which is present, this sulcus is known as a precentral sulcus. It runs parallelly to this sulcus which is present, which I have described. This sulcus is known as a central sulcus. Now, in between the central sulcus and the precentral sulcus, there is a presence of gyrus. This is known as a precentral gyrus. Now, in front of the precentral sulcus, this is the precentral sulcus. In front of the precentral sulcus, it's considered the two frontal sulcus. That is the superior frontal sulcus. This one is the superior frontal sulcus, and this one is the inferior frontal sulcus. Then after that, in between that, there is a present this portions. It will present the superior, medial, and the inferior frontal gyrus. Now in the parietal lobe. In the parietal lobe, there is a presence of the sulcus that is present. This sulcus is known as a postcentral sulcus, which is present just behind the sulcus, which is known as a central sulcus. Within this, in between that, there is a presence of the gyrus. This gyrus is known as a postcentral gyrus. Now after that, anterior to the postcentral sulcus, there is a presence of the one sulcus. This is known as the intraparietal sulcus, and it's considered the two lobes. This portion is known as a superior parietal lobes. This portion is known as a superior parietal lobes, and this portion is known as a inferior parietal lobes. Now the supramarginal gyrus. The supramarginal gyrus is present in this area. It is the upturned of the posterior rami of the lateral sulcus, and this gyrus is known as a supramarginal gyrus. Now the angular gyrus. This is known as a superior temporal sulcus. This superior temporal sulcus will continue and forms this gyrus which surrounds it. This gyrus is known as the angular gyrus. Now this sulcus is known as the inferior temporal sulcus, and after that there is a presence of the one more gyre. This portion is known as the arcus tempora occipitalis. Now the temporal lobe. Within this temporal lobe there is a presence of the two sulci. That sulci, this is known as a superior temporal sulci and this is known as a inferior temporal sulci, which runs parallel to this area, which is known as the posterior rami of the lateral sulcus. Now within this there is a presence of the gyre. This is known as a superior temporal gyrus, this is known as a medial temporal gyrus, and this is known as the inferior temporal gyrus. Now occipital lobe. This portion is known as the occipital lobe. Within this, there is the presence of the one sulcus that cuts the occipital pole and reaches the superior lateral surface. And this sulcus is known as a calcaneal sulcus. Now, at the end of the calcaneal sulcus, there is a one more sulcus that is present. This is known as a lunate sulcus. Now, towards the upper end of the parieto-occipital sulcus, when you cut these margins, which is known as the superior medial borders, there is a presence of the gyrus, which is present. This is known as the arcus parieto-occipitalis, and this fissure is known as a parieto-occipital sulcus. Now the lateral occipital sulcus. This portion is known as a lateral occipital sulcus, and this portion is known as a transverse occipital sulcus. Now, I have already talked about the little bit about the insula. Now, this is the lip of the lateral sulcus. The lip of the lateral sulcus gets retracted. Within this, there is the presence of this portion, which is known as the insula. And this insula means it is a hidden. This lobe is hidden, and it is present in the floor of the lateral sulcus. It is surrounded by the circular sulcus, except to this area which is known as the apex. The surface of the insula is marked by the number of the sulci and the gyri. Now the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. In the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, as you know, there is a presence of this structure which is known as the corpus callosum. Now above the corpus callosum, there is a presence of this sulcus which is known as the callosal sulcus. It is prominent sulcus which follows the curve of the corpus callosum, and it is 1 centimeter above and parallel to the upper convex margin of the corpus callosum. Above that, there is a presence of this gyre which is present. This gyre is known as a cingulate gyrus. Now, above the cingulate gyrus, there is a presence of one more sulcus that is present. This is known as a cingulate sulcus. This cingulate sulcus continues from this portion which is known as a corpus callosum, and it runs along the cingulate sulcus from the ascending area, and then after that what will happen is that this cingulate in the middle part of the corpus callosum, this cingulate sulcus move upwards and divide this area into the two gyrus. This portion is known as the medial frontal gyrus, and this portion is known as the paracentral lobes. Now within this, there is the presence of the artery. This is the anterior cerebral artery, which gives rise to the branches, and this artery is known as a pericallosal artery. Now one more gyrus that is present, which is known as a parolfactory gyrus. This portion is known as a parolfactory gyrus, and it is located in between the sulci, that is the two sulci of the pars olfactory sulcus, that is the anterior pars olfactory sulcus and the posterior pars olfactory sulcus. Now the paraterminal gyrus. It is located in front of the lamina terminalis. This portion is known as the lamina terminalis. In front of the lamina terminalis, there is the presence of this structure, which is known as a paraterminal gyrus. Now the gyrus and the sulci that is present in the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now we will talk about the orbital surface. This portion is known as the orbital surface. Within this orbital surface, there is a present sulcus. This sulcus is known as the olfactory sulcus, which runs along the bulb of the olfactory nerves. This portion is close to this border, which is known as the medial margins. Within this, there is the presence of the bulb, which I have already discussed, that is the olfactory bulb and the tract. Then medial to this olfactory sulcus, there is a presence of the gyrus, which is present. This gyrus is known as a gyrus rectus. Now this olfactory surface, it's considered of the Hshaped. It is the Hshaped orbital sulcus, and it divides these into the four compartments. You can see in the picture it is Hshaped. Now this portion is known as the anterior orbital gyrus. This portion is known as the posterior orbital gyrus. This portion is known as the medial orbital gyrus, and this portion is known as the lateral orbital gyrus. Now the temporal surface. This portion, which I have already told you, this portion is known as a temporal surface. Within this temporal surface, medially, there is a presence of this sulcus, which is known as a collateral sulcus. It begins from the occipital pole, near the occipital pole, and it is a long sulcus, which demarcates the uncus on the medial surface of the temporal lobe from the temporal poles. This portion is known as the uncus, and this portion is known as a parahippocampal gyrus. This portion is known as a lingual gyrus. Now the lingual gyrus is located in between this sulcus. This sulcus which is present, this sulcus is known as a calcarean sulcus, and this sulcus is known as a collateral sulcus. Between that there is a presence of this gyrus, which is known as a lingual gyrus. Then also medial to the collateral sulcus, there is a presence of one more gyrus. This portion is known as a parahippocampal gyrus, which continues anteriorly with this area, which is known as the uncus. Posteriorly, it will continue with the cingulate gyrus. Now the occipital temporal sulcus. The occipital temporal sulcus, this portion is known as the occipital temporal sulcus. This portion is known as the occipital temporal sulcus, which consists of this area is known as the medial occipital temporal gyrus, and this portion is known as the lateral occipital temporal gyrus. And this finishes the sulci and the gyrus of the cerebral hemisphere. Hope you like my channel and please subscribe my channel. Thank you.